Attention crew, this is your Captain Caliban speaking. This is a supplemental episode of Enterprising Individuals, where we bring you news and tidbits from the world of Trek, also interviews with special guests, and a few little surprises along the way. If you've been watching the new series Lower Decks on CBS All Access, I hope you'll consider joining us for Discoverage Thursday nights this fall. Every Thursday at 7 p.m. Central, I and my co-host Ella are joined by a special guest to talk about the latest episode of Star Trek Lower Decks. We're also talking about Trek news, and we take your comments and questions live on the air. Did I mention it's a live show? It is. We're covering every episode of Lower Decks, and then we're rolling right along with the 23 weeks of Trek into covering the show's namesake, Star Trek Discovery, when it returns for its third season this fall. Follow us at EISTPod on Twitter to get notified when we're going live, and you can tweet at the show using the hashtag Discoverage to join the conversation. See you Thursday nights. This week on the show, I'm joined by Dr. Ethan Siegel. Dr. Siegel is an astrophysicist and a writer and science communicator, and he's the author of a book called Treknology, The Science of Star Trek from Tricorders to Warp Drive. We like to think that the future of Star Trek and their amazing technology is centuries away, and in the case of warp drives or matter replication, that might be totally accurate, but many of the technologies we see on Star Trek are already achievable today. And I don't just mean flat-screen TVs or iPads or self-opening supermarket doors. Did you know that the U.S. Army has developed a non-lethal phaser weapon, or that a working tractor beam has been successfully tested in a lab setting? I mean, it can only tractor microscopic particles, but, you gotta start somewhere, right? Our technology is changing so fast that our world would be almost unrecognizable to someone from 100 years ago. How far would you have to go into the future until you didn't recognize the world? I don't know the exact answer, but I bet it's a heck of a lot less than 100 years. That's what Dr. Siegel is all about in his role as a science communicator, explaining the scientific principles behind the fictional technology we see on Trek and detailing how we could achieve those accomplishments with our current understanding of science. And that's what we're talking about in this hour. We also talk about how he got started with Trek, his work as an educator, and we discuss the way in which sci-fi and reality often borrow from each other. I hope you enjoy our talk. Thanks to Ethan for being on the show. You can check out his blog at startswithabang at Forbes.com. Stay tuned to hear how you can get his excellent book, Treknology. That's it for me. Set your phasers on understand. And with that, let's get underway. My guest on the show today is Dr. Ethan Siegel. Dr. Siegel is an astrophysicist, an author, and a science communicator. He's the author of the award-winning blog Starts with a Bang, where he writes about physics and astronomy. He's a regular contributor on science topics to Forbes.com, and he's the author of Treknology, The Science of Star Trek from Tricorders to Warp Drive. Dr. Siegel, welcome to the show.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me, and I'm so excited to talk to your audience about all things Star Trek.
Me too. It's good to have you aboard. I always ask new guests on the show how they first became Star Trek fans. How did you first discover Star Trek?
It's kind of funny. When I was maybe 11, 12 years old, I was aware that Star Trek The Next Generation was on TV, and my mom was a fan of the original series. And one day I decided to give it a shot, and I started watching an episode. And, this was like back in the season 1, season 2 days.
Sure.
And I didn't like it all that much. It wasn't a great episode.
Yeah.
And my mom was like, there's only one captain ever, and that's Kirk. And this guy will never be a Star Trek captain.
Yeah.
And then about 2 years later, my friends were telling me, like, you should really give this another shot. Like, you watched it early on. It wasn't that great. And I did. I turned it back on, and I was blown away by it. I was really blown away by it because it sort of combined this love that I always had for space and science and the future and what we could accomplish from a scientific and technological perspective. But it also brought in this aspect of altruism. It brought in this aspect of, we could work together to build this, this wonderful future where so many of the problems that plague our world today, like injustice and poverty and inequality and all these problems that we have, are no longer problems. The idea of having a unified Earth or even a unified galaxy where different civilizations all work together for the collective benefit of everyone, while everyone on board still maintain their own individuality and their own talents and their own skills, that was that was really like a vision of a utopia that spoke to me. And so it was Next Generation that really drew me into the Star Trek universe.
Yeah, and it's really incredible. Like, I don't know if this is Roddenberry's intention from a commercial point of view, but just putting that chocolate and peanut butter, the chocolate is, science and space exploration, and the peanut butter is this altruism and this positive view of the future. It's just such an enduring thing. I guess I've been doing a social experiment of sorts in the 5 years I've been doing this show, asking people how they discovered Star Trek. And so many people talk about how, if they're old enough, they're fans of the original series, but generally it's like their parents were fans of the original series and the way that they passed it down. And also having seen the original series and then seeing TNG, which was a little different, but eventually just began to fill the same niche and explore the same themes. And the way that Trek constantly changes, they're on a space station or they're in the past or the future. The more it changes, the more it seems to stay the same by just holding to those same ideals and giving you something familiar while changing the setting it's a great move for a franchise, just from a commercial standpoint.
I agree with that. One of the things I also like about it, now that I'm not 14 anymore and I've seen a wide variety of Star Trek incarnations, is it's become real clear to me that you can use this science fiction setting as a lens to talk about social problems and approach them from different angles, and also the intersection of technology with the issues we're facing. Like, that interface, you can really explore that very well in a Star Trek environment in a way that I think if you tried to not make an allegory, if you tried to do it directly, it would either seem too heavy-handed or it would seem preachy. And I don't think Star Trek generally suffers from that. I think that in Star Trek, you really wrestle with the emotional issues, and sometimes I find myself, strongly disagreeing with the ethics that they try to put forth as this is the right way to behave. And I find those aspects even more interesting because it makes me look within myself for why do I so strongly feel that way.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to think back to my time as a teenager, because now at age 41, I sort of look back and I think, some of those things where I was like, no, you have to go and you have to act this way. I don't think that way anymore. I think, to borrow from another sci-fi series, Battlestar Galactica, I love when the president there, Roslin, tells the young, ambitious captain, the younger Adama, Lee Adama, tells him, you're so hell-bent on doing the right thing that I worry you won't do the smart thing. And
yeah.
and she eloquently put into words probably why I admire Captain Picard so thoroughly, is because when you see the impulsive thing that usually Riker's the advocate for, where it's like, our Klingon allies are being attacked by the Romulans, we have to leap to their defense. It's like, no, they're having a war. We don't intervene.
Right.
Take us safely out of here. Plot a course and let them fight their own battles. This is not our fight. We don't want to drag the Federation into the war. And as a younger person, I look at that and I'm like, Riker's right. You have to stand up for your buddies. Get out there. And now I sort of see, maybe that isn't always the right decision. Sometimes it is, but not always.
Yeah. Being diplomatic in that case. Did loving Star Trek as a kid motivate you to pursue science as a career?
I don't want to discourage anyone who that's their experience, because I think that's the experience of many of the scientists I speak to, is that Star Trek was one of those things that really drew them into science or engineering or some technology-based career. And for me, it was actually the other way around. I think that I always had an interest in science and in how the universe worked and understanding how things came to be the way they are. And it was actually the fusion of that science and that altruism that drew me into Star Trek. And so I think that Star Trek was really my first exposure to the world of science fiction and hard science fiction that that I still harbor a love for today. So I think that people who are drawn into science by something like Star Trek, I think that's an incredibly valid and valuable perspective, and it's a useful function of Star Trek as well. But for me, it was actually the other way around, that it was a love for science that drew me into Star Trek.
Well, you get your PhD in astrophysics, and you've taught at the high school and the collegiate level, but then you decide, I don't think I want to teach. I don't want a research career. That's not what I want. And you focus instead on science outreach. What motivated that shift for you?
You know, it's kind of a funny story. I think we have this this word that we use as a dirty word in our daily lives, and that word is crisis, right? And a crisis is something where you're going down a path and you're pursuing a goal that you're like, this is what I want, this is what I enjoy doing, and you go out and you're doing it and you're working on it. And sometimes an event will come along, or a series of events will come along, and you'll have an epiphany and you'll have a realization to say, like, oh no, like, this isn't what I want to keep doing. I don't want to continue going down this path. This is not what I want for the remainder of my life. And what do you do when that happens? I say, you have a crisis, and you should have a crisis, because a crisis is not, oh no, my world is falling apart and I'm gonna fall apart as a result. It's really saying, I see the path I'm going down, and I don't want to continue going where it's leading. I need to make a change. What do I do next? And I've had that happen multiple times in my life. You mentioned that I was a high school teacher. That was something I did after college before ever really considering going to graduate school. And it was while I was doing that I realized, I'm doing fine at this, but it isn't what I want to do forever. What do I want to do next? And, for me, that answer was, I want to learn all I can about what the universe is, how it got to be this way, where it came from, and what its ultimate fate is. And I was very pleased to learn, like, this is not philosophy or theology or poetry or anything like that. This is a hard actual science. It's a science known as cosmology, and it's a branch of theoretical astrophysics. And I can go to graduate school. There are people who specialize in this, and I can study it. And so that was what I did. And then after that, you go down your path and you're saying, okay, well, I love what I'm doing and I love the research I'm doing and all of that. And it was actually while I was doing my research, while I was a postdoctoral research associate, that I started to have a bad experience. And I was like, maybe this isn't what I want to be doing forever. And so if I wasn't going to be a research professor trying to solve the mysteries of dark matter, dark energy, and cosmic inflation, what is it that I'd rather be doing? And I said, Ethan, you've always loved teaching. You've always loved sharing what you know with as wide an audience as possible, not just a classroom full of people, but the whole world. Is there a way for you to do that? And so I started getting involved in science outreach. And even though I was a professor after that for a number of years, I was always writing articles, speaking to the general public, blogging, making videos, doing radio and podcast interviews. And it got to a point in my life where I sort of said to myself, I can either try and do both and try and split my efforts and have a foot in the academic world and a foot in the science outreach world, or I can just say, what, this is what I want to do. I can try and make a go of it. I can try and make a career and a life out of this and devote my full efforts to doing that. And I made that decision a few years ago, and I haven't looked back since. So I know it's an unusual path, and I know it's not the way most people go about, living their lives is, doing something where if you had told me 15 years ago, like, hey, Ethan, this is what you're going to be doing now, I would have told you, like, that's not even a career. Like, nobody makes a living doing that. And that would have been true, but you never know what it is that you can do until you go out and you try and create it for yourself. And I've been very fortunate. I've gotten a lot of help along the way. I've had a lot of people, total strangers even, who have come to support me and tell me they believe in me. And, I remember when I was in graduate school, I asked my advisor, like, what it was that drove him forward. And he said to me, I love what I do every day so much that I can't imagine not doing it as long as someone is willing to allow me to make a living doing it. And I feel like that I didn't quite feel that way about the research I was doing. I felt more like, I can't imagine going through my life not knowing this. But once I learned what was there up to the frontiers, and I'm just banging my head against the wall like everyone else, trying to figure out like what's the next big breakthrough, and getting frustrated with not making it or making a tiny dent in things.
Yeah.
This was sort of the, maybe it's this. Maybe it's sharing the knowledge and the wonder and the appreciation about what we know about the universe with the general public, with everyone who's curious about it, not just people who've gone and gotten their PhD in the thing I got my PhD in. Maybe that's something that I can have that level of passion for, and so far so good.
Well, it's great that so many people blow through those moments of crisis simply because they just feel committed, pot committed to what they're doing, or they wouldn't question necessarily the path that they're on. And I myself had a moment like that a couple of years ago when I started writing and broadcasting, because I had been in the corporate world for so long and been so dissatisfied by what I was doing that I finally just sort of said, well, what if I just do something else and do this? And that's why we're talking today.
And that's fantastic, isn't it? I mean, you look even, to Star Trek, to something like this, and you look at all the different career paths that are out there, and you see people that you saw in engineering, in the medical field, all of a sudden, like down the road, they get a command position. They get they can switch careers too. They can switch specialties too. You don't have to be a one-trick pony. You can choose to cultivate what it is you're interested in. And I feel like that intersection of what you excel at and where your interest and passion lies, that's where that secret to living a satisfied life with your career and how you choose to work and spend your efforts, that's where that secret lies.
Yeah. I'd agree. Is there, just going back to something you said earlier, is there like an existential ennui for some astrophysicists in that we may never know some of these things that they're examining and experimenting and looking into? Like when you think of a biologist, we don't know the entire genome, the human genome or something, but over a process of time, we will have mapped it all, and then we'll have that information and hopefully be able to do something with that. But some of these theoretical things that we're dealing with, we may never get an equation of quantum gravity or something like that. Like, is there in the industry people who feel that way, like you do, who are just like, I don't want to keep banging my head against these problems and these questions?
Well, I mean, so one of the things that I think about that is I don't doubt that there are answers to those big questions. Is there a quantum theory of gravity? Either yes or no, there is an answer. Will we ever know what it is, if there is one? Will we ever know why there isn't one, if there isn't one? That I can't answer. From a theorist perspective, I will tell you some of the uncomfortable truths about theoretical physics that I don't think most non-theoretical physicists realize. And that is, when you have an idea for maybe things work this way, maybe this is how the universe is, maybe, right, you start having ideas about maybe it works this way. Most of the ideas that you will have are old ideas. They are not new ideas. People have had these ideas before. People have explored these ideas, and they have fallen out of favor almost universally for a good reason. So if you want to bring it up, you have to understand what's been done before and what do you need to do to make this a viable idea again. Second off, most of the ideas you have that are new ideas will turn out to be bad ideas. They will turn out to not work for some some reason. They will turn out to lead you nowhere, or to reduce to something simple, or to be deal breakers because we already have evidence that rules those ideas out.
Right.
And finally, even if you have a new idea that turns out to be a good idea, it still probably isn't going to be right. Most of the good ideas, most of the good and new ideas don't actually pan out in reality. You know, we have had so many of these. We had the first grand unified theories predicted that the proton would decay, and they built these enormous
Right.
tanks full of matter to look for proton decay. And here we are almost 40 years later, and the proton still hasn't decayed.
Right.
So, you know, I think that's a lot of what people are working on. And there's also a lot of speculations because there are so many unknowns. I don't think this is despair worthy, but I think it's, you know, you have to be a realist about it. You know, most of us who go into this, we want to take on those big problems. We want to solve those big problems. We want to say, you know, well, if the universe works this way, or if the universe that we don't know breaks some symmetry in this way, or has this extra particle, or this extra field, or this extra symmetry, or this extra whatever it is you invoke, then these would be the consequences. And can we go and look for those consequences? And this is a valuable endeavor, but it's also a frustrating endeavor, because you have to be your own harshest critic. You have to sort of think of, why would this be wrong? What can I look for to test this up against the prevailing theory? And that is a tall order. That requires, you know, a willingness to see the value and to feel satisfied with the value you've added in doing this type of work, that maybe all it does is it brings up a new idea that you investigate and rule out or constrain. And that is valuable work, but it has to be valuable to you with the day-to-day work while you're doing it in order for it to be worth it.
Yeah. They also serve whose theories get shot down.
Yeah, and, you know, and look, I'm not going to pretend that there aren't people all over the field and in many related fields whose ideas do get shot down because they do fly in the face of evidence, and they continue to plow ahead and pursue them anyway because, you know, well, I can just tweak this or save that or invoke this extra symmetry or whatever to make it not ruled out. And in that sense, you can never rule a theory out. But we have a rule of thumb that I kind of like, which is you get to invoke God once. You get to appeal to divine intervention once. If you have to do it multiple times for your theory to work, right, people are going to look at you funny, and no one's going to follow the work you're doing. And I think that's a pretty good rule of thumb.
It seems like it. Your first book, Beyond the Galaxy, is for lay people, but it deals with astrophysics and difficult concepts. And when you're discussing or writing something for people who don't have a scientific background, how do you try to make it more digestible and bridge that gap between academia and the average reader?
You know, I don't think it's that hard. You just have to remember what it was like for you, or what it's like for the people you teach, or what it's like for the people you know before they've learned something. Before someone knew something, what is their mindset? Mm-hmm. And can you find a starting point where that person is comfortable? For instance, when I taught Intro to Astronomy, I didn't start with like, oh, here are the stars and here's how we measure them and here's what we look at. I start with, you know, when you look up at the sky, what do you see? And if you were a cave person, if you were on this earth 10,000 years ago and you looked out at the sky, what would you observe? What would you observe day to day, night to night, over the course of a year, over the course of many years? When you watch the sky, what would you see? What stays the same and what changes? That's something where everyone is familiar. Everyone is comfortable with that. People can understand that and relate to that. And I think whatever topic you're talking about, that's where you want to begin. You want to begin at a place where you and your audience are comfortable, where you're speaking to them and it's just like you're having a normal conversation about a topic that you want to teach them more about. So you start talking to them about it, and then you take a step. You take a step up in difficulty, or you say, okay, like, I'm going to introduce this new thing with which you may or may not be familiar, but we're going to start discussing it. And you do it without jargon, you do it in plain English, you do it without equations, and you just start explaining what that next step is. And once you get everyone comfortable on that next step up, you can take another step. And this is something that you just continue to do, and you work towards this ultimate goal of, I want to teach you how the universe began. I want to teach you why our universe is full of matter and not antimatter.
Right.
I want to teach you why we think dark energy is real. I want to teach you what evidence we have for dark matter. Right? You start doing this, and you can do it about any topic. But you have to start, in my mind, you have to start where people are comfortable, and at least where they feel comfortable. And then you slowly lead them step by step towards where you want them to go. And if you do it successfully, if you do it right, they will get to the end and be like, oh, wow, I feel like I get it. Also, how did I get here? How did I wind up understanding that dark matter is real and what its properties have to be, where we started off and you were sort of telling me about how the Earth goes around the sun, and now we're talking about dark matter. But if you can do that, that's why I sort of say, like, look, science is science, but science communication is a fusion of art and science, because it's a creative endeavor for how do I tell this story in a way that it's going to resonate with you.
Yeah. Your second book is called Treknology, and in it you attempt to give some real-world perspectives on the fictional technologies of the Star Trek franchise. And this is not like an in-universe technical manual, but an attempt to explain how Star Trek technology could be achieved with our current understanding of physics. What made you decide to write this book?
It was really a labor of love. I remember when I was in high school, I read the book, The Physics of Star Trek by Lawrence Krauss, and I read it in high school, and I was fascinated by some of the things, and I was like, oh yeah, like, if you're a theoretical physicist, you could just, like, know all this physics and compare the physics of Star Trek with the actual physics that we know.
Yeah.
And it got to the point where I'm communicating science for a general audience. I'm still a big Star Trek fan. I've watched all of Next Generation multiple times, and many of the other series, either all the way through or much of the way through. And I realized this big anniversary was coming up, right? It was going to be the 50th anniversary of the premiere of the original series. It was going to be the 30th anniversary of the premiere of Next Generation. And I started thinking about these technologies and how much fun is it to look back on this vision of the future that people had in the 1960s or the 1980s, and to actually look at where technology has taken us. Because for me, we had technologies that these were all seemingly futuristic when they were proposed, and yet many of them we thought, like, oh, you'll have to break the laws of physics, you'll have to violate the laws of physics to make these possible. Well, it turns out that there were still a few of them, a handful of technologies that we would have to discover new physics in order for them to work. But it's not like we'd have to, like, throw out all of the physics we know. Like, how would physics have to be different if we wanted this to work? But then there were other technologies where we maybe once thought these might be impossible, and it was just sort of a fictitious writing device that brought them into reality. But now they are physically possible. We've learned enough about how photons work and electric fields work that we've actually made tractor beams for little tiny particles, like macroscopic particles, but particles nonetheless. And we can pin them in place and adjust these electric and magnetic fields and draw them in or push them out. And wow, you know what? That sounds like a tractor beam to me. So in some of these cases, it's really just a question of scaling them up to have them on a starship scale. In other cases, these technologies have already been created, even though people don't know about them very much. Like, The military, for example, has made the equivalent of a phaser. They have made a device that is a two-phased laser pulse, where the first phase is this little bit of ultraviolet radiation. And what that ultraviolet radiation does, if you know matter is made of atomic nuclei and electrons, what it does is it kicks those electrons off of the atom, so it creates a tiny little bit of a plasma. And if you just hit someone with that ultraviolet radiation, with that ultraviolet laser, yeah, you won't feel very much. Like the plasma might get a little bit hot, but that's it. That's the only thing you'd feel. And you can send a second pulse, this infrared radiation. And infrared is what your skin feels as heat. So again, if you just hit someone with this infrared laser, it would just feel like a warm spot, and that's it. But if you two-phase the pulse, if you first hit someone with the ultraviolet pulse and you create this ionized plasma, and you then hit them with a very energetic infrared pulse, those ionized electrons in particular are going to be really efficient at absorbing that infrared radiation. And if you pulse your laser fast enough and hot enough, what's going to happen is that ionized plasma is going to absorb that radiation, absorb that energy, and it's going to heat up and expand and make a concussive blast that's going to knock someone off their feet, that's going to possibly knock someone unconscious, but that isn't going to have the potential to be lethal the way that baton rounds, or what we call rubber bullets, can be lethal. And I feel like this is a tremendous advance. And people are like, well, why don't law enforcement have it everywhere? And the answer is, well, right now we don't have it in a little like phaser format. We have it as a tank mounted weapon. But if you could get it down to even being like one of those plasma rifles that you see on Star Trek, that would be just a tremendous advancement in law enforcement, because it could disable a target for up to 2 kilometers away. And imagine what a nonviolent solution that could be for law enforcement. So you start talking about, wow, like that was fiction, and now we're working on building it. And some of these technologies, we don't even bat an eyelash out. You pull out your smartphone and you're like, wow, like the original series in Star Trek thought it would be wonderful if we had an electronic clipboard. Star Trek The Next Generation thought that these PADDs, these pads, these like that would be like, wow, what an advance. And it's no doubt that the original iPad was in fact based on the Star Trek The Next Generation pads. And now here we are, like just less than 15 years after the first iPad came out, we all have smartphones in our pockets that are far more powerful than anything that was envisioned in a 1990s incarnation of Star Trek. And that's really remarkable too. So for me, writing this book, it was sort of a no-brainer of, I'm a scientist now. I have this expert knowledge. And the stuff I'm not an expert in, I can go find it out. Wouldn't it be fun to not just look at physics technologies, but to look at all of these technologies that were used in Star Trek? And that's where the idea for Treknology came from. And I was lucky enough to work with a partner in Quarto and Voyager Press that worked very closely with CBS and Paramount and Viacom to get the license rights for the images to stills from all these various Star Trek series and movies to appear in the book. So I think the right confluence of circumstances came together at the right time, and we wound up with a product that I was just so pleased to participate in, to write that book, to find the illustrations, to learn the science behind it. And I'm very pleased to report that there are 28 technologies featured in the book, and 24 of them are feasible with our current understanding of physics. Only 4 of them out of the 28 would require new physics for us to actually make them a reality, and that's really remarkable.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Something that stands out for me as unique about Star Trek in comparison to other sci-fi franchises is that the science or technology is so important to the day-to-day storytelling of the universe. Other sci-fi franchises like, say, Star Wars, they have science fictional technologies, but it's often in the service of something cool like lightsabers. But in Trek, the technology is often, if not always, the focus of the storytelling and really, guides the story along. We're examining how these technologies have changed a society and the benefits and the problems they can cause.
Yeah, I think that's something where you think about like, wow, how do people feed themselves in space? And and they're like, oh, we have food replicators, and that was something that the original series brought up, and of course, like the replicators got even more advanced in Star Trek: The Next Generation. But then you had something like Star Trek Voyager come along, where here's how the replicators work, and here's how they pick up matter, and really, if we want to get home again, we shouldn't be wasting the matter that we're accreting or accruing as we travel through the universe. We shouldn't waste that on replicator food, so everyone has to eat Neelix's garbage poison cooking and try and survive that. And poor Harry Kim has to like save up his replicator rations for weeks so he can get a clarinet, and he can play his clarinet so Tom Paris can fall asleep, or whatever it is that comes down. I think that the interplay of technology, and I like how certain technologies for Star Trek have been around there for long enough that the characters take it for granted until they can't anymore. Like that's really a nice way to explore the dependence of our lives on various technologies and how we adapt in the absence of those technologies.
Yeah, that is a really great point, and I wonder about their world and how, because we see amazing technology that stays relatively recognizable through the various eras of Trek, and I wonder how often they would have scientific breakthroughs or technological turnover in their world. Like, they figured out a lot of things, but is there or would there be points where they go, oh, we just figured out something totally new that we were working on, and now everything has changed for everyone? I think the holodeck could be an example of that. Or, I don't know if you've seen Picard, but there's a sequence where Picard goes to Starfleet Academy, and there's like just a bank of these doors that are supposedly transporters, I guess, and people are just kind of walking in and out of them with no complicated procedure, no setup, no energize. It's just like they've really come to some breakthrough in terms of like transporting people places.
Yeah, I mean, I think we see that in Star Trek, and I have seen Picard, but I think it becomes really apparent if you start looking way back at Enterprise, right, with Captain Archer, and you start where the transporter is a new technology, and Archer is grumbling about how he wouldn't send his dog through that thing. And I think, there's actually a real worry to reckon with there. You remember the Next Generation episode where they find Will Riker's transporter accident clone, Thomas Riker, stranded on a planet that they visited like 9 years before, where everyone thought like, oh no, we got Will Riker. I think about this like a computer. Like, okay, I know that I could take my file and I can just cut it and paste it, right? I could just Control X, cut it, and Control V, paste it. Right. And what that does is that doesn't change your file. It doesn't change the bytes in the file. They stay in the same place. All that I'm changing is the address. I'm just moving it, right? Mm-hmm. That's what you want. What you don't want to do is you don't want to Control C it, where you make a copy, you delete the original, and then you Control V and you paste a copy, because that's murdering someone every time you use the transporter. You murder someone, you create a clone of them, where to everyone else, if you did that to me, no one else would know the difference. You've created an identical Ethan Siegel with the same hairstyle and the same DNA and the same memories and the same thoughts and the same connections, but you've created it all anew, and the original one is dead, and no one ever knows. And I've wondered about that. Is Will Riker the copy, or is Thomas Riker the copy? Would Captain Archer's dog be the same dog? I love my dogs. I don't want to send them to the transporter and stop them from existing and wipe them out and have some new dog instead, even if I can't tell the difference. So I think like when we saw like the evolution of the transporter, that's a big one. But I think if you also look at, geez, remember, I don't think they could go past like warp 5 in Enterprise,
Right,
and they
right.
they couldn't do warp 9 in the original Star Trek, and now we can do these things. I think the advance and the progression of technology, it really can be transformative. I think with Discovery, if they had been able to keep and maintain and use the spore drive
Right.
thoroughly, wow, isn't that better than a warp drive? Wouldn't it be better to just instantaneously go from one spot to another in the galaxy
Sure.
rather than have to travel by, folding the space in front of you and expanding or rarefying the space behind you and creating these warp signatures? I think when you realize a new way to solve a problem, sometimes that new way is superior. And once that happens, wow, we'll never go back to the old way. There's no reason to do it. And we can do it if we have to, and this technology becomes unavailable for some reason. But as long as the new technology exists, we're always going to use it. I remember it was only about 5 years ago, I was at a meeting and people were just flipping out because they had to do a video call and they couldn't find the remote to turn on the video broadcasting system. And I'm looking at them like they're all idiots, and they're like, but what are we going to do? We can't, where is it? And everyone's looking for it. And I get up and I walk across the room and I go push a button on the device to turn it on. Because you don't need a remote. You could just turn things on with the button on the thing itself.
Yeah.
And I did that, and people were like, oh yeah, you don't have to turn everything on with a remote. You can turn some things on with a switch or a button too.
Yeah.
But you don't use it for long enough, and you forget that that's how you can do it.
Yeah. You talk in your book about how when man first started going into space, it was framed as the next great adventure for humanity. The maps are all filled up on Earth, so let's go out into space. And we put our dreams into space travel and exploration, but also our fears in a lot of ways. And there's a lot of cautionary sci-fi about man's reach exceeding his grasp and being too curious. But Trek rarely, if ever, has that as a theme. Trek is pro-technology, and it's positive to the point that sometimes I think those clear ethical issues aren't satisfyingly explored. Like the show originally couldn't exist without the transporter because they couldn't afford to show them landing on a planet. But now the whole franchise just, works and lives on this idea of transporting people. And so I don't think that, except for an episode like the Thomas Riker one, they can't really explore that question of, are you killing somebody? Because it would just shut everything down. Or there's that one episode where they kind of touch this. They learn that the warp drive could be destroying the fabric of space. And so for a little while, they have to go, warp 5, have a speed limit. But then they almost immediately drop that because, of course, we need all these technologies to survive. And I wonder if the technology of Trek and the way it's depicted is essential to their positive view of the universe, to the goodness of the Federation.
I think there is that aspect of it. But when I look at Star Trek, the ethics issue it focuses on are really how does this impact individual people? How does this impact, the most marginalized among us?
Sure.
So that I feel like is where the real ethical issues come into play, because, you can weigh the needs of the many against the needs of the few, which is a, very important theme, or you can weigh privacy against security like they do in one of my favorite Deep Space Nine 2-part episodes, where they have Homefront and Redemption, I think, is the 2-part episode where basically they're worried that the Dominion is staging a coup, that the changelings are staging a coup on Earth, that they have changelings impersonating Federation officers, and they're going to make a power grab on Earth, and they're everywhere. And so Cisco comes in and basically is going to mass test the planet to make everyone prove that they're human.
Yeah.
That he's going to take blood or a sample, a biological sample from everyone on the planet, and they're going to see that. And he meets his dad. We get to meet Sisko's dad, and Sisko's dad tells him, like, son, this isn't how we do it. We're all free. We all operate under the assumption of innocence, and we don't trade our privacy and our autonomy for this illusion of security. And I was, it's so impressive today that this is a discussion that happened years before 9/11 happened. And Sisko, quite, this stuck in my head like for a long time when I watched it. What Sisko does is he basically just tells his goons, like, hey, just grab my dad and inject him and take his blood and see if he's a changeling or not. And of course he's not.
Right.
This is Sisko's dad, and Sisko has to just live with that. He just has to live with, you know what I did? I violated my principles. I violated the trust of my family, all for nothing. It didn't even accomplish anything, and I went and I did that anyway. And I feel like that's one of the real strengths of Star Trek, and in particular, I think that's one of the strengths of Deep Space Nine is Sisko messes up a lot. A lot of them mess up. A lot of them make the wrong decision. And it doesn't mean that they're bad people and they're forever unredeemable. It means that, you know what? You make a bad decision. You know what you have to do? You have to live with it, and you have to try and fix it and do better next time and atone for the mistakes you made. And I feel like that is a really, really valuable lesson. I know this moved away from that ethical question about curiosity quite a bit, but I feel like that's where the real strength of Star Trek lies, is exploring what are your actions, what are their consequences. When your actions have those unintended consequences, how do you respond to that? What do you do next? Because I think the rest of the way that played out, it was about gathering more information, learning more about this, and saying, okay, we're not going to do it this strong arm way. We're going to find another solution. Yeah. And I think that creative solutions to problems that oftentimes people were unaware of existed, that's one of the places where Star Trek as a franchise really shines.
Yeah, I agree. I think that Trek, the writers aren't scientists and they're not futurists, but they do a pretty sly job, I think, of keeping things plausibly vague for future technology. Like, presumably, the Federation has mastered a theory of everything to manipulate gravity and space the way they do. But, we don't have, like, a quantum theory of gravity, so they kind of pick their own terminology and they lock into it and expect you to follow it that way. And dark matter and dark energy are something that you'd expect that people in Trek would have a much greater understanding of, but it's almost never mentioned in the show because we know so little about it now. So every once in a while they'll find a dark matter nebula or something, but we won't really talk about that or the implications of what they found.
Yeah, and I think if you think about that, hundreds of years in the future, there's a good chance we won't be talking about dark matter, whatever, because we will have a better description of what that is. We don't talk about missing energy from nuclear reactions anymore. We talk about neutrinos because we know where that energy went and we know what particles are there.
Right.
They have invented all sorts of new types of particles in Star Trek, from whatever a dilithium crystal is to chronoton particles. And they that's fine. Like, they just give them names, and that's great. Like, give them a name and use them and leave it vague enough that when the science actually gets there, you're not shoehorned into some hokey explanation that's just totally wrong. I think that's a very smart move on the part of Star Trek writers is to leave it vague enough. There's a famous story where they talked about, oh, well, how could a transporter work if you can't know the position and momentum of your particles simultaneously?
Right.
And they just said, oh, like, well, we have a Heisenberg compensator.
Yep.
And so then they say, okay, well, how do the Heisenberg compensators work? And the answer is they work very well, thank you.
Yes, right.
And what a great non-answer is that.
Yeah, they sure talk about gravitons a lot, and of course gravitons are merely hypothetical, in our era. And if they had actually discovered a graviton or something like that, you think they'd give it a name it after the guy that discovered it. But graviton just communicates so much in that word. Like you get, oh, it's gravity, I get it. So I think it's a good idea that they just sort of kept that going forward in the show.
Yeah, and from a theoretical physics point of view, a graviton actually means something very specific, just like we have the photon is the particle that mediates the electromagnetic force,
right.
And we detect them when we look at the sun or any sorts of light with our eyes. The graviton is the particle responsible for gravitation in theoretical physics. It is the force-carrying particle that would mediate the force of gravity in any quantum theory of gravity. In theory, gravitational waves, those ripples in space-time that LIGO has already detected, those waves are made out of particles called gravitons, just like the light waves we detect are made out of individual quanta of energy that we call photons. Yeah. So when someone says gravitons, they're just, we're betting on that gravitons are real. They are the way we think they are the correct description of gravity, and we're going to run with that. And that may turn out to be true. It may also turn out not to be true, or it can turn out to be true, and hundreds of years in the future, we still won't know whether it's true or not. So, I think it's fine to bet on something panning out. I remember there was an episode of Next Generation where, someone said to Data, like, well, Data, there's a very big difference between you and a nanite. And, what's to say a nanite is alive? And Data looks back and says, like, well, there's a very big difference between you and a virus, but both are alive. And, according to most biologists today, viruses aren't alive.
Yeah.
Viruses don't exhibit enough life processes to be considered alive on their own. So, I think it's unreasonable to expect science fiction to get all of the details about science right, but I think it is reasonable to expect that they will get the general principles and general stories right, and just like everything, as we learn more, they're going to be revised, and that is unsurprising that happens in the Star Trek universe too, that new technologies appear and supersede the old ones, and then we don't talk about the old ones anymore. And I liked that big jump forward in technology from the original series to Next Generation, and I think it's very interesting that here in 2020 we actually have surpassed many of the technological expectations of Next Generation. That, that was 30 years ago when they were setting it 400 years in the future. And here we are just 30 years later, and you know what? Some of those things that we thought were going to take 400 years, we're already there.
Yeah, it's hard to predict computers, and they wisely came up with their own unit of storage, the quad, to try to get around that. But I love the fact
that definitely don't want to bet against Moore's law these days.
Yeah, right. Like, I love that when you've got a lot of reading or work to do in Star Trek, it means you've got a ton of pads on your desk, and they just couldn't imagine that, say, thousands of books could fit on a chip the size of your fingernail, or that your pad could just get them from the cloud. Like, cloud computing and wireless communication for devices are two things that they didn't quite get right.
Yeah, it's fun to talk about that, isn't that? They would never have imagined, like, what are you doing with this enormous ship's computer with a full database of all the knowledge of everything ever? And you're like, hang on, like, I could fit all of the text in all of Wikipedia on like on a set of solid state devices, the palm of my hand.
Yeah.
I could fit all of it in there. What are you doing with this massive ship's computer? But yet, because they didn't know that the internet would be a thing. They didn't know that you could just send a query to some like decentralized database and get an answer back in a tiny fraction of a second.
Yeah.
That was a technology it did not anticipate. But on the other hand, some of the things that they did anticipate, you remember there was again an episode of Next Generation where Barclay becomes like the greatest genius in the world. And he just decides he's going to build a device to directly interface his brain with the ship's computer. Sure. And the ship's computer is like, I have no idea how to do that. And he's like, oh, well, then I'll just tell you.
I'll
and
you.
Like, next thing you know, on the holodeck, there's Barclay in his chair hooked up to the computer, controlling everything.
Yeah.
That's a technology that was unimaginable to the writers around 1990 or so, existing 400 years down the line. And yet that's exactly the type of technology, direct neural interfaces, that people are actively developing today. So I think when you look at what did we anticipate correctly, what did we fail to anticipate, I think it's really, really remarkable, and we should kind of be awed by how successful Star Trek has been. Its success rate is really high.
Do you think that that's a product of them predicting the future or the future emulating Star Trek?
I think it's a little of both, right? Sure. In the case of the communicator, that flip thing becoming the cell phone, although the people who invented it for Motorola swear that they didn't rip it off Star Trek, they totally ripped it off Star Trek. Like, they totally did. As far as the iPad, Steve Jobs said in an interview where it was him and Bill Gates and a moderator a few years before, like, they were talking about, how do you see technology developing? And Bill Gates gave like a pretty long nuanced answer, and Steve Jobs was like, Star Trek. I see Star Trek, just give me that. And then the iPad came out, and Mike Okuda, who made those pads, who made the mock-ups of the pads that they used in Star Trek, like, his design was the design that they emulated the original iPad after. So I think in many cases, there was recently a tricorder X Prize that Qualcomm invested in to say, we're going to have a contest to build a medical diagnostic tool that fits in the palm of your hand that can perform these 12 functions, and it has a maximum weight limit of 5 pounds. And they awarded that X Prize, I think, in 2017 because someone has achieved it. And I think in a fun twist, the company that achieved it was named Final Frontier Labs. Because this is in a lot of ways science fiction, and Star Trek in particular, they give people something to strive towards. They give people something to look towards and aspire to having that be the reality. And I think that is equally as important as it is to guess successfully how science and technology will develop moving forward, is to give people something to strive towards, is to give people a goal. I don't know that we would have the language apps that we have and the ability to translate text and language and audio the way we do if it weren't for Star Trek envisioning a universal translator.
Yeah. I think about the future of Star Trek, and I don't think we ever really see this on screen, but I think about if there would be people in the future of Trek who would be Luddites and who would want nothing to do with technology, and how the show might depict them. Because I think, we've talked about all the amazing technologies and how they support the altruism and the egalitarianism of the Federation. I wonder if Trek really sees technology as inherently moral, and its use for uplifting people as like a moral imperative.
The only time I recall seeing anything like that in Star Trek was, you would occasionally run across like a society where technology led to widespread death and destruction, and then they ban a whole bunch of it. But that leads to a whole slew of problems on its own that often requires the very technology that they eschew in order to fix those problems. Yeah. And so I think Star Trek isn't afraid to wrestle with the issues of what is the ethical uses of these technologies, but it does come across pretty strongly with that message of, yeah, you need to figure out the ethical use of the technology and make that the norm. The path forward is not to ban the technology, it's to use it responsibly. And when people use it irresponsibly, we all need to band together to say no. And that's something that goes all the way back, perhaps most famously with eugenics, to the whole Khan storyline.
Sure. Or even Bashir and being genetically modified.
Yeah, that's true as well. Like it appears again and again throughout Star Trek, and Bashir is an excellent example.
Well, as we get to the end here, I wanted to mention some technologies that we don't often see in Star Trek. Outside of, we don't see a lot of prosthetics outside of something like Geordi's visor or Nog's leg, which we're told about but never really see. It isn't until Discovery that we actually see implants and cybernetics. And I wonder if that's an aesthetic decision by the creators of the show, or if it's an aesthetic sort of idea in the Federation, like it's distasteful for them to see people, being part robot or whatever.
I'm not a Star Trek writer, so I can't really speak to that.
I suppose
but
that's
what I like to think about that is, if you were to ask me as a kid, like, what's the biggest example of prosthetics, I would say, oh my gosh, it's the Borg, right? Look at the Borg. Look at all the use of prosthetics with the Borg. And I think that's because one of the things that we struggle with, one of the themes of Star Trek, is sort of that line between human and machine, is that line between what makes something alive. When does something give rights? They explore this with Data, they explore this with the Borg, they explore this with, I think that interface there is a source of our discomfort. And so I think that when they were bringing that storyline up in the late 80s and the early 90s and things like that, that was the alien. That had the alien feel that, Spock did in the original series. But now it's not some other race or some other species that threatens us. It's that line between human and inhuman, between machine and mankind. And I look at that and I think, the fact that we do have all of this on Discovery now, the fact that we do have, these hybrid human machine parts that are just integrated together, and that's normal on Discovery or on Star Trek Picard, I think that's sort of evidence for how our social comfort with that technology has evolved.
Interesting.
I think it's kind of important for Star Trek to push that envelope forward, and then not to return to that same envelope decades later, but to say, okay, where has the needle moved to, and let's go there.
Yeah.
Let's make that thing that was a contentious issue, let's make that normal now, and let's move on to the next set of issues.
We also don't see a lot of artificial intelligence in Star Trek. I mean, we've got Data, obviously, but he is, unique. And whenever we do run into a computer, it's an evil computer that's, doing something or other bad. And we do see in Discovery what might be sort of the root of a possible distaste for AI in the Federation with control. But I'm just wondering if that is a similar, if that comes out of just the roots of Star Trek's roots in 60s sci-fi and just not thinking much about AI, or where that comes from. Because you talk in the book about the incredibly powerful computers on the Enterprise that must be at least semi-sentient, able to write their own code, able to interpret context. The whole thing about, like, have the Doors read the script, because how do they know that somebody's got a devastating bon mot to deliver, before they leave, and the door waits for them to do it. And I just wonder why we don't see more Starfleet officers interacting with AI or seemingly intelligent machines.
I don't know that either, but I imagine when I think about artificial intelligence, there are it's become very fashionable recently for people who call themselves futurists to talk about the dangers of AI and artificial intelligence, and to worry that, like, oh, the machines are going to do this, and, there's sort of this, like, dystopian fear of, like, a Terminator-like future.
Yeah.
I have a hard time sort of thinking that, oh, artificial intelligence is the problem. We still almost always need a human to tell the artificial intelligence how to go about doing its business. And then the artificial intelligence can learn and complete whatever tasks it is set to or programmed to learn how to do to complete pretty successfully. But that's still dependent on what it's been programmed to do. I'm not sure that we will ever see an artificially intelligent machine that can basically do all of the things that a human being can do, right? We talk about things like a Turing test, and look, I'll be the first to admit, based on some recent conversations I've had with people on various social media, that maybe most humans couldn't pass my Turing test. That it's pretty hard to say, like, if you can't make a Roomba that doesn't consistently get stuck in the corner, what makes you think you're going to be able to make an artificial intelligence that can actually successfully interact with a human where a human wants to have those interactions?
Right.
Because for the most part, unless I'm playing a well-programmed video game, and that's arguably what humans have done, that's arguably more of the human interaction than the AI interaction. I'm not convinced that is a way that technology is going to develop is to have, like a HAL 9000 type of computer where we do send all our interactions through them. I can't stand, for instance, using, Siri or Cortana or Amazon's Alexa. I can't stand using any of those. Those things are not experiences I enjoy, so I don't use them at all. And does that make me old-fashioned? Maybe, but also I think those technologies just aren't very good. And I think that until those technologies are that good, like basically I'm in the camp of, you have to prove it to me before I'm going to accept that this is really as good as you fear it may become in the future.
Yeah. You mentioned that in the book as well, that even with their incredibly advanced computers in the future, we still see the characters getting frustrated and mad at the computer all the time.
Yeah.
Some things never change.
And wouldn't you? Like, I think that's a very human thing, is like, holy crap, like, we spent 400 years developing you, and you still don't know what I mean when I tell you I'm going to go take a leak.
Somebody, I think it might be author William Gibson, said that the singularity that people like Ray Kurzweil talk about, isn't going to be something where we just flip a switch and suddenly the world is totally unrecognizable. It's more of a gradual or a generational thing. And he posits that we've been in something of a rolling singularity for the last 50 to 100 years. Even 50, 60 years ago, you could bring somebody to our future now and they just would be gobsmacked and unable to understand how we're doing some of the things that we're doing.
Yeah, I mean, think about your grandparents when you were young. Think about what your grandparents' world was when they were young. And imagine just, pulling them out of, pulling them out of their world in the 1930s and plunking them down in the world now and saying, like, hey, it's almost 100 years later. What do you think? And they'll be like, okay, like, I recognize some of these things, like they're like, I recognize the roads and the automobiles and the buildings and the infrastructure like this, but what the hell is all of this computer stuff? Right. And what is all of this, like, weird devices people have, and why do the cars talk to you? And why, like, there are screens everywhere on everything. What happened to a good old-fashioned billboard? And, we can grump about that, and maybe 100 years from now, if we were around 100 years from now, we would be grumping about the same things, about like, oh, like, what's with all this, like, neural noise I've got being hooked up to my auto Twitter where I hear the average thoughts of 3 billion people at once. Right. Maybe that's what our version of the Borg collective will be, is we will have just a cacophony of voices, like something horrible out of a Philosopher's Stone in Full Metal Alchemist. I don't know.
Right.
Who knows what's who knows what's coming, but it sure is fun to speculate, dream, and then to compare those dreams with what's actually physically possible with known science. There are so many wonderful possibilities for how things can develop that I'm really thankful for series like Star Trek that encourage us to use them in a way that benefit all of humanity.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's cool to think that we may be creeping ever closer to the type of world that we see on the screen.
You know, I think, the pendulum always swings. It swings forward and back, and it's easy to look at the world the way it is right now. We're recording this on July 22nd, 2020, and to say, like, yeah, there are all sorts of reasons to be upset at the world and to think that we're never going to achieve the future that Star Trek dreams about. But at the same time, all of these efforts really are moving forward. People are working on developing new technologies for the betterment of humanity, and the vast majority of humanity absolutely supports that. And I think it's important to remember that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks so much, Dr. Siegel, for talking with me today. Let people know where they can find you online.
Sure. My name's Ethan Siegel. I write the column Starts With a Bang at Forbes.com, and you can find me on Patreon at Starts With a Bang. On Facebook, you can like the Starts With a Bang page, and I'm on Twitter at Starts With a Bang, so look for me there.
Great. And your books, Treknology and Beyond the Galaxy, are available on Amazon and other places.
They sure are. They're at Amazon, they're on Powell's, they're at Barnes & Noble, and anywhere that books are sold.
Great. Well, thanks again.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me. Live long and prosper.
You too. Hey, Trekkies, I'm Caliban.
And I'm Gooey Fame.
And we're the hosts of the new podcast, Backtrekking. I thought that we were going to say it together.
Oh, Backtrekking. Do you want to do it again?
Just don't worry about it. Every week, we look at the real-life inspirations behind classic Star Trek episodes.
The original series, Next Gen, DS9, Voyager, and more. And we're examining the actual events, stories, and concepts that they're based on.
Join us as we go trekking through sci-fi history.
You know, we have a time machine. Let's go back and do the intro again.
Hey, Trekkies, I'm Caliban.
Backtrekking!
God damn it!